In this episode, we are going to look at one of the most important habits a beginner technician can build, which is learning how to separate processor, memory, and motherboard problems before buying parts or pulling good hardware out of a machine. These three areas are closely connected, so when a computer will not start, freezes early, reboots for no clear reason, or shows only a blank screen, they can all seem guilty at the same time. That is why beginners often make expensive mistakes here, because the symptoms feel serious and the fastest reaction is to blame the biggest or most expensive component in sight. A better approach is to slow down and notice what kind of failure is happening when it happens and what the machine is still able to do before it stops. Once you understand the symptom patterns that are more common with the central processing unit, CPU, random access memory, RAM, and the motherboard, you can make much smarter decisions and avoid replacing good parts just because the whole problem looked scary at first. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A computer starts in stages, and that is one reason good diagnosis depends so much on timing. If the machine never reacts at all, that points toward a different kind of problem than a machine that powers on, spins fans, flashes lights, and then stops before showing anything useful. If it reaches the logo screen and freezes there, that tells a different story from a machine that restarts over and over before the display ever wakes up. A beginner should think of startup like a short path the machine has to travel, with each stage proving that some basic hardware work has already happened. When the machine stops, the place where it stops becomes a clue. That clue does not always tell you the exact failed part immediately, but it helps you avoid the mistake of treating every serious symptom like it means the same thing. A system that dies instantly, a system that partially starts, and a system that starts but becomes unstable later are not all telling the same story, and that matters when you are trying to isolate CPU, RAM, and motherboard trouble. The reason these three components get mixed together so often is simple. The motherboard holds everything together, the CPU handles the basic processing needed for startup, and our RAM has to be available very early so the machine can move into normal operation. That means a failure in any one of those areas can stop the startup process before the operating system ever has a chance to explain what is wrong. To a beginner, that can make the whole machine look dead, even when it is actually giving clues through lights, beeps, partial startup, or repeated restart behavior. The important lesson is that these parts are connected, but they do not usually fail in identical ways. A technician does not need perfect certainty right away. What matters is learning to ask which component seems most likely based on the kind of behavior the machine is showing, rather than assuming that because all three are important, they are all equally likely to be bad every time the computer refuses to cooperate. RAM problems are often among the first things technicians think about when a system powers on but does not fully start. Memory is needed very early, so if the modules are missing, poorly seated, incompatible, failing, or dirty at the contact points, the machine may never make it far enough to behave normally. What makes this tricky for beginners is that memory trouble often looks dramatic without looking specific. The fans may spin, lights may turn on, and yet the system may never show a useful image or may keep restarting before it reaches a normal startup screen. In other cases, the machine may power on and then stop with a beep pattern or a status light sequence. These are the kinds of clues that make technicians think about RAM early, especially when the system seems partly alive but cannot move through startup in a stable way. The key idea is that memory trouble often stops the system early, but not always silently, and that is why partial startup with no normal progress often puts RAM high on the list of likely causes. RAM problems can also show up after startup, which is part of why beginners sometimes miss them. A machine with bad or unstable memory may boot some of the time, freeze at random moments, crash under load, restart during software installation, or behave differently from one day to the next without any clear pattern that points directly at memory. That inconsistency is itself a clue. When a system fails in many odd ways without settling into one clean symptom, Technicians often keep RAM in mind because memory issues can affect almost every part of what the computer tries to do. A bad drive usually causes storage-related trouble. A display problem usually stays in the video path. But unstable memory can make a healthy system look generally unreliable. That does not mean every random crash is a memory problem, but it does explain why technicians are careful here. A beginner should remember that memory issues can look broad and messy, which is exactly why calm reasoning matters more than jumping to the first part that sounds important. CPU problems are usually treated differently because true processor failure is not the first thing technicians blame in most ordinary support situations. The CPU is central to the system, so when it truly cannot function, the symptoms tend to be severe, early, and difficult to ignore. A machine may fail before it can get very far into the startup path, may show little or no useful display behavior, or may act as though the system never became fully alive. Even so, beginners need to be careful not to overuse the CPU as a guess whenever the problem looks serious. Supporting conditions around the processor often cause similar symptoms. Power delivery to the processor, heat buildup, firmware support, socket issues, or board-level problems near the processor can all make the machine behave as though the processor itself is at fault. This is one reason experienced technicians do not call the CPU bad just because the machine seems lifeless. They know that a processor is part of a larger environment, and trouble in that environment can produce the same cold, stubborn startup behavior a beginner might blame on the chip itself. Heat gives another useful clue when thinking about the CPU. If a machine starts but later freezes, slows down heavily, or shuts off after it has been running for a while, technicians start thinking about thermal problems before they start blaming the processor as a dead part. The CPU creates heat during normal use, and if that heat cannot be controlled because of poor cooling contact, dust buildup, bad airflow, failed fans, or dried thermal material, the system may become unstable in ways that feel random to the user. A beginner might say the processor must be dying because the machine becomes unusable during hard work, but the more accurate idea is often that the processor is being pushed into an unsafe temperature range and the system is protecting itself. This matters because replacing the CPU in that situation may solve nothing at all. The real problem may be cooling, case airflow, or a motherboard fan control issue. And that is exactly the kind of expensive wrong turn technicians try to avoid by reading the symptom pattern more carefully. Motherboard problems are some of the hardest for beginners because the motherboard touches almost everything without acting like a single simple function. A bad drive has a storage role. A bad screen has a display role. A bad board can make many different parts appear bad because it is the platform tying them together. That is why motherboard failure often looks broad, strange, or inconsistent. The system may power on but never finish startup, may stop recognizing devices correctly, may lose stability after hardware changes, may fail to respond to power controls in a normal way, or may behave differently depending on what parts are connected. A beginner should think of the motherboard as the pathway and support structure for the rest of the machine. If those pathways are damaged, unstable, or poorly powered, the symptoms may spread across memory, storage, graphics, and processor behavior in ways that make diagnosis feel confusing. That does not mean the board is always the answer when nothing else seems clear. It means motherboard problems often create mixed symptoms because so many other components depend on the board to work properly. One very common beginner mistake is to assume that if the system has power, then the motherboard must be fine. That is not true. A board can have enough life to light indicators and spin fans while still failing in the parts of startup that matter most. In the same way, a board can pass power to some components but fail to communicate properly with memory, graphics, storage, or the processor. This is why technicians pay attention to the difference between basic electrical activity and healthy system behavior. Lights and fans prove some power is present, but they do not prove the board is functioning correctly as a platform. A machine that turns on and then freezes at the same point over and over, or one that recognizes some hardware, but not other hardware without a clear reason, may be pointing toward board-level trouble even though it does not look completely dead. The lesson for beginners is that partial life is not the same as full health, especially when the motherboard is the part under suspicion. The logic of elimination helps because it keeps you from replacing the most expensive part first just to feel like something is being done. Technicians try to narrow the problem by asking what the machine is still able to do, what changed before the failure began, whether the symptom happens early or late, whether the behavior is consistent or messy, and whether the failure seems tied to one area or spreads across several functions. A machine that gives memory-related beeps, stops very early, or changes behavior when memory is changed may point more strongly toward RAM. A machine that becomes unstable mainly under heavy work or heat may point more toward processor support or cooling conditions rather than immediate memory failure. A machine with broad, platform-wide odd behavior, especially after other obvious causes have been considered, may point more toward the motherboard. This style of thinking does not promise instant certainty, but it keeps the technician from treating hardware replacement like gambling, which is how good parts get removed and money gets wasted. A helpful beginner mindset is to stop asking what part is the most important and start asking what part best matches the symptom pattern. Importance does not diagnose failure. The CPU is extremely important, but that does not make it the most likely problem every time the machine refuses to start. The motherboard is central, but that does not mean every strange issue should be called a board failure right away. RAM is used early and often, but not every crash proves the memory is bad. The point is to match behavior to likely causes instead of letting the seriousness of the problem push you into blaming the biggest name component. Technicians become more accurate when they notice patterns instead of reacting to fear. If the system changes behavior when heat rises, that matters. If it never gets far enough to show normal video, that matters. If it is wildly inconsistent and affects many unrelated functions, that matters. Good isolation begins when you stop ranking parts by cost or importance and start comparing them to the actual clues being shown. Recent changes are also very important, especially for beginners who are still learning how often hardware problems begin after something was moved, cleaned, upgraded, or reassembled. A machine that worked yesterday and now fails right after memory was added does not tell the same story as a machine that has been slowly growing unstable for weeks. A desktop that began having trouble after a new cooler, new graphics card, or motherboard movement may be revealing a support condition problem instead of a sudden random part death. A laptop that started crashing after overheating events may point toward thermal damage or board stress rather than simple software trouble. Technicians always pay attention to what changed because hardware problems do not appear out of thin air as often as beginners think. Many failures follow heat, physical movement, power events, poor installation, or a recent part change, and that history helps you isolate the most likely area without jumping blindly from one replacement to another. Another clue beginners should learn to value is consistency. If the machine fails the same way every single time, that can be helpful because it means the problem is stable enough to observe clearly. A repeatable failure at the same point often suggests one specific weak point in startup or one specific hardware condition that the machine cannot get past. Inconsistent failure is different. A system that sometimes boots, sometimes freezes early, and sometimes restarts later may point more strongly toward memory instability, overheating, or board-level issues that affect many paths at once. Neither pattern gives you the answer by itself, but both help shape the logic of elimination. Technicians like consistent clues because they make the fault easier to narrow. When the symptom is messy, they think more carefully about components such as RAM and the motherboard, because those kinds of failures often spread wider and create more than one kind of complaint instead of behaving like a single simple broken part. It also helps to remember that technicians are trying to protect good parts, not just find bad ones. That may sound obvious, but it changes how you think about the job. If you replace a healthy processor because the machine looked dead, you have not really solved anything even if the computer later works by chance after several other changes. If you throw new memory at every unstable system without noticing heat or board damage, you may spend money while teaching yourself the wrong lesson. If you call the motherboard dead whenever the problem feels too confusing, you may miss simpler causes and create a repair that costs more than the device is worth. Good troubleshooting is partly about finding the failed component, but it is also about leaving healthy components alone until the symptom pattern gives you a real reason to suspect them. That habit saves money, protects working parts, and makes your diagnosis more trustworthy over time. A simple way to bring all of this together is to think in layers. First, ask whether the machine has no life, partial life, or unstable life. Then ask whether the failure happens early in startup, later under load, or in a random mix of situations. Then ask whether the symptom looks more like early memory trouble, processor support or heat trouble, or broad platform trouble tied to the motherboard. You do not need to say these exact words out loud every time, but the thinking matters. It keeps you from moving straight from fear to replacement. A beginner does not become skilled by memorizing one dramatic fix for each symptom. A beginner becomes skilled by learning how to sort symptoms into useful groups and how to protect healthy parts until the evidence points more clearly in one direction. That is how technicians isolate CPU, RAM, and motherboard problems without turning every difficult repair into a pile of unnecessary replacement parts. By the end of this topic, the main goal is not for you to become instantly certain every time a system shows a serious hardware symptom. The main goal is for you to stop treating CPU, RAM, and motherboard problems like one giant blur and start seeing the different ways they tend to appear. RAM problems often show up early or inconsistently and can make the whole system look unstable. CPU-related trouble is often severe but is frequently tied to power, heat, or support conditions around the processor rather than the chip itself. Motherboard trouble often creates broad, confusing behavior because the board connects so many parts of the system together. When you use the logic of elimination, pay attention to timing, notice what changed, and match the symptom pattern instead of panicking over the seriousness of the failure. You make better decisions, save more good parts, and become the kind of technician who solves problems instead of just swapping hardware and hoping for the best.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.